What is practical wisdom and why do we need it so much in our era? My guest today, Professor Barry Schwartz, is the author of the book Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing. In this conversation, we talked about practical wisdom, why it's important, and why it is so challenging in our progressive era. In addition, we also discussed some of his other books, including The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less. Hi, and welcome to my channel, The World of Rועי, Yosevich. In this channel, I speak and converse with the most interesting people from all around the world, discussing science, philosophy, religion, artificial intelligence, and more. If you find this talk interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. And like I said before, my guest today is Professor Barry Schwartz. Professor Barry Schwartz is one of the most interesting psychologists I've ever read. He's an American psychologist and author. He was a professor of social theory and social action at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, and now he teaches at UC Berkeley. Schwartz is widely recognized for his great TED Talks and great books, including The Paradox of Choice, Practical Wisdom, Why We Work, and more. So without further ado, Professor Barry Schwartz. So, Professor Barry Schwartz, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm honored to be with you.
Believe me, I'm much more honored than you. And Schwartz is a Jewish name. Have you ever been in Israel?
Yes. It must be now 20 years ago. I went with a synagogue group. I don't want to get into trouble, but the synagogue I belong to is a very progressive synagogue, criticizing Israeli policy with regard to the occupied territories when that was unknown in the U.S. There was a lot of criticism in Israel, but in the U.S. you were not allowed to ever criticize Israel, and we did. And the rabbi took us on a trip where we went to the occupied territories, we went to the holy sites, and it was quite extraordinary. But
so you went to the occupied territories?
Yes.
How was it? You know, this is Samaria. This is like in the origin of the birth of the Jewish story. Very, very interesting place, I would say.
It is there. It is a very interesting place. We spent most of our time in Jerusalem, which is obviously also a very interesting place.
Yeah.
It was during the Second Intifada we went, and it was, you could sort of feel the tension in the air. We went to a major demonstration. I don't remember what the demonstration was about, but it was quite alarming to see people, civilians, carrying rifles. As bad as the gun situation is in the U.S., I was not accustomed to seeing people who were not military or police with rifles slung over their arms. It was an
Tell
experience.
me about it. My wife carries a gun, so I know
Really?
Exactly what you say.
Yeah.
It's very funny. Now, I have so much to ask you because your work spanned, I think, like over 50 years, and you did so many things, but apparently you became famous. I'm sorry to say that, but you became famous after your first TED Talk is The Paradox of Choice. Yes?
Yes.
And my question before we dive into a question that I hold for like 10 years, wanted to ask you, how does it feel to become famous as a psychologist, not as a celebrity?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I don't think of myself as famous. It's not like people stop me on the street and ask me for my autograph. And one thing that I discovered is there's a kind of jealousy among academic psychologists, because a lot of us have written books for popular audiences, and most of them don't go anywhere. I mean, Gladwell seems to have cornered the market on writing books for popular audiences that involve social science. And so, my book was successful, and I could sense people thinking, why him, not me? His book isn't any better than my book was. How come he got all his attention? So their attitude was almost like I was fooling people. I pandered to popular audiences, oversimplified, told untruths, and they, of course, had too much integrity to do any of those things. So that's why they had been less successful. But I have not, frankly, noticed that I am, quote, famous. The only way in which I've noticed it is that students, who, of course, are very internet savvy, know an awful lot about me before we have our first meeting at a class. And that takes me a bit by surprise. But aside from that, I'm just an ordinary guy.
I know that what you're saying is true because your wardrobe at your first TED appearance and at the second TED appearance. In the first TED appearance, it was like a very casual Israeli, not formal. And in the second TED appearance, it was, with a tie and suit. It was.
Well, let me explain why.
Okay.
Let me explain why. When I did the first one, there was no posting of talks on the internet. So there it was, and we were in England, and it was incredibly hot, and the event was in a theater that was not air conditioned. So everybody was just schwitzing, so everyone was dressed the way I was dressed, and no one gave it a thought. And then 6 months later, I get this release to sign. Can we put this up online? And I laughed. I signed it, and I said, it's not like anyone's going to watch these things. TED was just starting then. The second one, my wife made it very clear that if I showed up looking the same way this time, she would throw me out of the house. So it wasn't because I had become famous. It was because my wife gave me an ultimatum.
Okay. Actually, I have a question regarding your wife, but we will save it to later. Okay, let's start with the first question. In the first TED talk, you presented the concept of the paradox of choice, which meaning why sometimes less is more. Why, when we have much more choices, we end up being more miserable. And you gave wonderful examples. But I think in the same TED talk, or maybe 1 year after, Malcolm Gladwell went on stage and told another story, which was completely 180 degrees opposite. He told the story of
sauce.
Yes, about the spaghetti sauce and Howard Moscovich was approached by Pepsi, and when aspartame was invented, and they wanted to know what is the exact right amount of aspartame to put, and 8% was too bitter and 12% was too sweet, and they wanted him to say what is the best Pepsi or the best diet Pepsi. And after all of his research, he came to the conclusion that the question was wrong all along. And you shouldn't seek for the best Pepsi, you should seek for the best Pepsis, many different. And then he went out to work with Prego versus Ragu and made many different genre or many different variations of tomato sauce. Right. Now, Malcolm Gladwell and you are the complete opposite. How do those two presentations, in your opinion, reconcile?
Right. So people often misunderstand the argument in the paradox of choice. The argument is not that choice is bad. Choice is good. The argument is that because some choice is good, it doesn't mean that more choice is automatically better. So there is a sweet spot. Do I know what the sweet spot is? No. Is the sweet spot going to be the same for every consumer? No. Is it going to be the same for every product? No. Maybe you want 12 kinds of spaghetti sauce. Maybe you want 100 different kinds of automobile. The point is that adding options does not necessarily make people better off. It might make people better off, but it doesn't necessarily, which means that you have to, despite what Moskowitz said, you actually have to do that research and figure out how many spaghetti sauces are the right number of spaghetti sauces to give people the variety that they want. And there's another thing too. You can't separate one choice, one decision from the context. And so if you go to the grocery store and there are a few versions of a few options with regard to every product, and there are 20 different kinds of spaghetti sauce, it's not a problem, because mostly there are 2 or 3 options. But if you go to a grocery store and there are 40 or 50 options in every category, well, now a nightmare has been created. Because if you actually scrutinize all the options in every category, you'll starve to death before you finish shopping. So it's one thing to increase options in one category and leave everything else the same. But when options start exploding in all categories, then you have the phenomenon that I wrote about, which is instead of being liberated by all these options, people are paralyzed. But it doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen to every person. And it is simply true that choice is good.
Okay. Now, the book was published in 2004. And
Right.
now it's 2023. So it's been almost 20 years.
Right.
In the past 20 years, what have you learned about the sweet spot? Can you tell me something about the sweet spot that, maybe like give me like a hint or a direction towards when more choice is better, when less choice is better?
There are only, surprisingly, there may be a lot of studies that have been done by companies who don't publish. They're trying to figure out how much variety to offer. So they do this research and they come up with an answer, but they don't share that answer. The academic studies, there are only a handful, and they all seem to suggest that 10 or 12 options is the sweet spot. But I hesitate to suggest that there is a general answer. 10 or 12 may be too many when you're choosing toothpaste, and not enough when you're choosing jeans. So I don't think there's a magic answer, and the only way to figure out the sweet spot is by doing the research. You're a jeans manufacturer, and you figure out empirically how many different styles you should be offering to your customers. And there's no question that if you decide that instead of offering 50 styles, you're going to offer 20, some customers will no longer be able to find what they like. You will lose some, but you will gain more customers than you lose by making the choice problem solvable instead of unsolvable.
Let me take it, with your permission, to more psychological, philosophical observation.
Sure.
In the Jewish wedding ceremony, one of the blessings is that we wish the new couple to be happy like Adam and Eve. And the concept of Adam and Eve is twofold. One, Adam didn't have a mother-in-law, but the most serious one, according to tradition, Adam had no other woman to compare to.
Yeah.
And this is like a mind-blowing thing, because in our society, when you decide to settle and get married, this is the woman that you love. But, the one before and the one before. And the idea of choice, sometimes you can do like a research, because sometimes the idea that you don't have anyone to compare with will give you the best life.
Right.
What's your take on that?
Well, so this is a terrific question, and it is a very complicated one.
Thank you.
When there are no options, then you can't do social comparison. The question you're asking is this good, and not, is this better than that?
Yes.
And most of the time when we make decisions, we are doing comparisons. We are always asking, not is this good, but is this better than that? And the question is, how many that's? And the interesting thing about our psychology is if you compare two items, and it's a difficult choice, item A is going to be better than item B in some respects, and it's going to be worse than item B in other respects. Now, you would think that the comparison between A and B, A will benefit from the respects in which it's better than B, and be hurt from the respects in which it's worse than B. Seems right.
Yes.
Interestingly, because of our psychology, we focus much more on the negative than we do on the positive. And so if A is better than B in terms of price and durability, but worse than B in terms of style and color, say,
and you decide to go with A, you will always be disappointed from style.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on, oh, what a good deal I got, and oh, how long these will last, you focus on, oh, I wish it were tapered more, and I wish I could have gotten this in darker blue. So there is what's known in the literature as a negativity bias. We focus on what we're giving up in the rejected alternative more than we focus on what we're gaining in the accepted alternative. And so now let's talk about making a marriage.
Because you kept your marriage for 54 years. So
that is correct. And
I know, yes. So
the truth is we became best friends in the 8th grade. We were 13 years old when we became best friends, but we were not a couple until we were 17. And we married at 20.
You became friends, best friend, girlfriend, wife.
Yes.
For 54 years.
Yes.
And I don't buy this BS of luck. If you kept your marriage for 54 years, luck has nothing to do with it. This is a hard, tedious work for 54 years.
No, I think that's right. But here's the thing. Here is what I think where we've gone wrong when it comes to forming these kind of intimate attachments. We have been sold in the West the belief that somewhere in the world is the perfect partner.
Prince Charming.
And your job is to find that person. And once you find that person, it's downhill all the way. Everything is easy. So all of the work is in the search. This could not be more wrong. I think all of the work, you find a good enough partner, and then what makes it a great relationship is the work you do with the relationship to make it flourish, to keep it alive, to prevent it from getting stale, to respect one another as each of you changes, and all of that. So finding the right person is in some sense the easy part. Keeping that person the right person is the hard part. And we've somehow, and with online stuff, it's become all that much worse, because now there's a sense in which you could take a look at every romantic partner on the planet. So yeah, I'm just going to spend my time finding the perfect mate, and then I'll just sit back, light a cigar, and the rest of my life will be gravy. And instead
I even go further, and I would say that the archetype, I think. Archetype. Our archetype of romantic relationship in Western society is Romeo and Juliet. And they never were a couple, a true couple, that need to handle a joint bank account. So the idea of our vision of what is the best romantic couple ever, which is Romeo and Juliet, had never been a real couple with real problems.
Right. And the same thing is true with all of our big decisions. There's now a lot of, I don't know if this is happening in Israel, it's certainly happening in the US, a lot of people quitting their jobs.
Yes.
Once COVID started, mass resignation. And you have the same sense that a lot of people think somewhere out there is the perfect job, and my job is to find it. So all the work is in search. And once you've found it, it's gravy. Well, I think that's, again, exactly wrong. There are certainly bad jobs, but a lot of the time, whether a job is good or not depends on what you make of it. And the real work begins after you start. It's not about the search. It's how you craft the job. It's how you give the job meaning. It's how you interact with your fellow employees. And you can turn a mediocre job into a good one, and a good one into a nightmare. But by focusing on finding the perfect job, you know, it's like anytime you have a bad day at work, you think, oh, this job was a mistake. There's got to be a better one out there somewhere. The same every time you have a fight with your partner. It's like, oh.
And now you teach millennials and Gen Z, which in like those kinds of arguments, I think are deeply inherited in their psyche.
I think that's right. I think that's right. You know, it's only true, I believe, in rich democratic societies that people have this attitude. And we did a study that just came out about 6 or 8 months ago, asking the question, is there too much choice, too little choice, or just the right amount of choice in various different parts of life? Healthcare, consumer goods, I don't remember what the category, jobs. And we asked people these questions in China, Russia, Brazil, the United States, Japan, and one other country. And here's what we found. In general, more people felt they had too little choice than too much worldwide. Less true in the US than in other places, but in general, more people thought there wasn't enough choice than that there was too much choice. And people were more upset when they had too little choice than when they had too much choice. So there's a sense in which the book, The Paradox of Choice, is a book about rich people's problems. The world does not have this problem. Americans have this problem. Israelis have this problem. Most Europeans have this problem. But this is not a world problem. And,
yes.
I was not sufficiently sensitive to this when I wrote the book.
And I think that what you just said, we will cover in depth regarding your second book, Practical Wisdom. Just before we move on, my wife and I always ponder, you know, there is extreme high divorce rate in the West. And I think part of it is because that every Disney film ends at the marriage and they live happily ever after. Yeah. Like the marriage ceremony, like the wedding ceremony is the pinnacle of what relationship is all about. And it's not the pinnacle, it's a starting point.
Exactly.
It's not the pinnacle.
That's exactly right. You know, there's the word that is used in the US when people graduate from high school, from the university, it's called commencement. I mean, it's called graduation too, but it's called commencement. But the word commencement means beginning. And so the right way to think about your university education is not that this is the goal line.
At the end, yes.
This is the start. And I think here too, we've got this problem that for a lot of people, getting the degree is the goal. You know, and then you can just sit back and coast. Instead of this is the beginning. I've now got the tools to to educate myself for the rest of my life. This is the start of my life, not the end of my life. And the same exact thing I believe is true when it comes to marriage. So I think you're right. I think this is not just a problem with millennials, but I think it's grown more acute in the last couple of generations than it was, say, when I was their age, 1 million years ago.
Which leads us to the concept of virtue and arete. And from there, now, before I dig into practical wisdom, I want to go in, I want to cover the meta. In your second book, Practical Wisdom, and the book can be here, Practical Wisdom is the right way to do the right thing. And in a moment, I will ask Barry, why should I care? And why should I want even to do the right thing? Now, in Practical Wisdom, some of the conclusions that you raise that we don't need more rules, more laws, and more regulations. We need less, which sounds surprisingly similar to the conclusion in the Paradox of Choice, that sometimes more choices is bad. Now, those two books relates to two very different subjects, but do you see some internal, intrinsic connection between that your work always stem to the conclusion that we need less and not more?
No, I don't. I think that's a coincidence. There is, however, let me just mention I wrote that book with a close colleague and dear friend, Kenneth Sharp, who I taught with at Swarthmore College for many years. So our inspiration in that book was the philosophy of Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher. And one of his so virtue is a very important part of his framework. And he thought, in answer to your question, why do we care about doing the right thing, is that authentic happiness, real happiness, not smiley face happiness, but the kind of sense that you've lived a good life, requires that you have virtues and display virtues in your interactions with the world and in your interactions with other people. But a central point for Aristotle was this idea of what he called the mean, which is, the mean is a technical mathematical term. It means the average. But what he meant was not the average, but the right amount. And so, courage, to choose a virtue. Courage is a good thing. Can there be too much of a good thing? Of course there can. But we don't call it courage when there's too much of it. We call it something else. We call it recklessness. And so when you have too little of it, it's cowardice. When you have too much of it, it's recklessness. When you have the right amount, it's courage. Now,
it is a golden path. What Maimonides, like one later on in the Middle Ages, will call the golden path. We have
the golden, and Aristotle called it the golden mean. But the problem is that the mean suggests that there's a formula. There's not a formula. What courage means when you are, say, in a military situation will be different from what courage means when you're at a political demonstration, will be different from what courage means when you're having a difficult encounter with your adolescent child. Courage is very much context dependent, and Aristotle thought pretty much all virtues were context dependent. And your job as a wise person knows in this context what courage looks like. In this context, what honesty looks like. A lot of young people, to get back to relationships, a lot of young people think that friendships and romance have to be built on complete honesty. Absolute honesty between friends, absolute honesty between romantic partners. And it's a lovely sentiment, but what I tell them is if they live their lives that way, they will live their lives alone. Because
they didn't read Nietzsche. They didn't read Nietzsche.
No, they didn't.
If you want to base your relationship on 100% honesty, you will be a very sad, lonely man. That was Nietzsche said.
Exactly so. And I don't mean malicious lies, but lies that you ask yourself, what does my partner need in this moment? And maybe what your partner needs in this moment is that you bend the truth. Not in the service of protecting your well-being, but in the service of protecting and promoting your partner's well-being. Doctors have to give patients bad news sometimes. There are many different ways to give patients bad news. And your job as a doctor is to figure out, how does this particular patient need to get the bad news? Is this person going to disintegrate before my eyes if I say cancer? Or is this person the sort of person who really wants to hear what it is and what awaits? Well, you can't answer that question with a formula. And you can't answer that question unless you know the person you're talking to. But without lying to your patient, finding the best way to deliver the news that will allow this person to go forward and not be completely destroyed is part of your job as a doctor. And incidentally, you know how much training doctors get in this, at least in the US? This is how much.
Yes.
This is how much training. They learn how to do it by doing it wrong. and seeing how bad the mistakes can be and slowly becoming better at it.
You have one chapter in your book, What Can We Learn from Janitor and the Judge? And sometimes the janitor in the hospital will be much wiser, wisdom-like from the doctor. By the way, what you say is so true, and this is why we have so many, I have good news, bad news, that the doctor comes to the patient. Yes, I have a good news and a bad news. Okay, start with the good news. From now on, there is a disease on your name. Okay, so okay. Now, I will tell you what I'm going to do in advance because I'm a very nice person. I'm going to attack your premise on the book, and I will tell you that the book cannot lie, or you cannot build your conclusion on the basis of secular modern society. This is basically what I'm going to do. But beforehand, I want to make sure that we understand the gist and the main point of the book. So I summarized it, and let me tell you if I summarized it correctly, okay? Practical wisdom, and this is your book, argue that the key to good judgment and decision-making is not just knowledge and rules and regulation, if you may, but type of insight and understanding known as practical wisdom, hence the book name, or the ability to see the bigger picture and understand what is the right thing to do in a given situation, just like you told me about the doctors, taking into account the unique circumstances and people involved. According to the book, practical wisdom is becoming increasingly rare, and that the lack of wisdom is responsible for many of the problems in our society. And you also provide in the book framework for developing practical wisdom and emphasize the importance of balancing rules with intuition and creativity.
Yeah. Now, maybe this is going to anticipate what you're going to, why you're going to say you can't.
This is a good summary. This is a good summary.
A good summary, but I might just add something.
Yes, because I got it from ChatGPT.
Not really.
I kid you not. I asked ChatGPT. I modified something, but I got, most of it from ChatGPT. I asked, could you please summarize Practical Wisdom by Barry Schwartz? And then ChatGPT summarized your book.
Oh my God!
Yes, it is very good.
Well, that's a conversation for another day. But
yes,
here's what I would add, and this may relate to where you're going to try to get me in a minute or two. We divide practical wisdom into two components. One is the skill to do the right thing, that is to make the judgment about how to talk to the patient or how to talk to your adolescent kid or whatever. And the second is the will, the desire to do the right thing. And if you have the skill, but not the will, what's going to happen is you'll use that skill to manipulate other people, take advantage of other people to serve your aims, not theirs. So skill without will leads to manipulative, destructive people. Will without skill leads to people who blunder in one situation after another. They always mean well, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to hear people and figure out what they need. So you need both of them. And the question that I have been asking myself, and Ken has asked, is where does the will come from in a secular society? It isn't hard to see where the will to do the right thing comes from in a religious society, because religious teachings are all about what it means to live the righteous life. But in a secular society, where it's up to each of us to figure out what a, quote, righteous life means, where does it come from? And in a highly pluralistic secular society like the US,
wow. This is very tough. This is very tough. Now, I will tell you that there are two separate orthogonal questions. One is one that Pinker might say, or Sapolsky, what are the evolutionary roots of will, of moral sentiment or moral acting in secular society? Okay, but the other is, what is the intellectual justification for will in secular society. And this is a whole different question. Let's say that I can trace the evolutionary roots of moral behavior in primates. But why should I care? What is the moral, the intellectual justification in a secular society? And from what I understand, this is what MacIntyre in After Virtue says, that you cannot deduce moral values from the intellect, like J. Moore tried to do in Principia Ethica. This is a doomed to fail project from the very beginning.
Well, it may be doomed to fail. That seems a little pessimistic. I would say it's a project that can't fully succeed, but I think you can make progress. So, for example, the most significant moral philosopher of the 20th century, arguably, was John Rawls. And Rawls wrote a book 60 years ago called A Theory of Justice. And in this book, he tried
I don't like this veil of ignorance, and I think it suffered from many intrinsic problems, intellectual problems.
I don't think he solved the problem. But it seemed to me what he was trying to do is give an answer to the question that you raised. Is there an intellectual justification for doing the right thing? And what does doing the right thing mean in a way that's consistent? And he, unlike most of us, he made his assertions and assumptions explicit. He thinks egalitarian is better than inegalitarian. And he thinks that reasonable people, rational people, in the veil of ignorance, if you don't know what, for your listeners who don't know the book, if you don't know where your position is in the society, what kind of a society would you choose if you were just going to be plunked into it in some random place? And his argument is that people will choose egalitarian over inegalitarian societies if they don't know where they're going to be. And then the question is, well, what kinds of rough rules do you use to make decisions about how the society runs, given that our preference is relatively egalitarian? And he has a bunch of answers to that. I don't think it's an adequate account. I don't think MacIntyre thinks it's an adequate account. I know Sandel doesn't think it's an adequate account. These are all very influential philosophers of the last 50 years. But it's a start that is secular. Unlike, say, Kant, who spent his life writing about these things, this very issue, but his perspective was thoroughly theological. At the root of it was theological. And so Rawls and Michael Walzer and other distinguished philosophers were trying in their efforts at systematic moral philosophy to give a secular answer to your question. Why should I care about doing the right thing? And as I say, I don't think it's adequate, but I also think it's not a complete failure. And so secular moral progress has been made.
This is very, very strange, because you say secular moral progress has been made, and you know what happened in the US, like in the past 20 years, from Thomas Sowell once wrote that when he was a teenager and he lived in Harlem, things were much, much harder for a black young man to become what Tom Sowell became. But now things are much easier. But when he speaks with young black males, they say, what option do I have in the US? I said, what are you talking about? You have much more options. And from what I see, if you look at the woke movement, at the extreme progressive movement, and if you look at the BLM, you know, it's very hard to say that secular progressive has been made.
Mm-hmm. Well, but here, I think you're conflating two things. One is the sort of philosophical / principled standards for judging whether progress has been made, and the second is the psychological. So here's what I think Saul was experienced. Whatever our life circumstances may be at a given moment, we are asking ourselves, how am I doing compared to what? Compared to how the guy across the street is doing, compared to how the guy with white skin is doing, not compared to how my ancestors were doing. And so every time you ask yourself, how's my life going, you are making a comparison. And the problem is that as options and standards have improved for people, minorities, especially African Americans in the US, expectations have improved, have gone up right along with them. And so it may feel like you're running in place. You're still, I don't know if you know this, but forget salary. Salary is bad. The wealth differential between Black and white people in the US is astonishing. The average wealth, I think, of Black people in the United States is something like $12,000, which is to say that the average Black person is 1 month away from disaster. Even if the salaries have been getting closer to each other, the wealth discrepancy has remained mammoth. So if you're a 25-year-old Black person who just got the college degree and you ask, how am I doing? You're not interested in how you're doing compared to your slave ancestors. You're interested in how you're doing compared to the people you went to college with whose skin was a different color. Now,
so what you're saying is that the more society becomes egalitarian, the more harsh and hard feelings and bad feelings we will have psychologically, because we don't compare ourselves to the past, just to the near present. And this is
no. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that you can't use people's evaluations of how their lives are going as the answer to the question, how are people's lives going? It's an answer, but you can be dissatisfied and be wrong to be dissatisfied. You know, every adolescent in the United States thinks his or her life sucks. Everyone, 100%, right?
Yes.
Now,
tell me about it.
We know that that's not true. Their lives don't suck. There are things about their lives that are disappointing. There are things about their lives that they wish were different. All that is true, but their lives don't suck. Some people's adolescents' lives really do suck, but almost everyone thinks about what they're missing out on, what they're deprived of, and so on. So we can't use that as a criterion for whether we are succeeding in creating a better world than the world we lived in.
Just a second, but let's say that, but in a secular world, what will be the criteria if it's not what I feel personally? If I feel disappointed, if I feel that my life is suck, okay, there is nothing more. Let's say that you are in a religious world, so in heaven, the truth is out there, but you can say, okay, you feel that everything is bad, but it doesn't matter because everything is good. But how does it come into existence with my own personality, with my own behavior?
You ask very hard questions. I don't want to say it doesn't matter. What I want to say is it's not decisive. It's not the only thing that matters. But you are right that in secular societies, and again, especially pluralistic secular societies, it's not clear what the standard is if it isn't how individual people feel.
Okay, let me move on to the word virtue. Okay, now before I going to quote MacIntyre, according to your book, what is the meaning of the word virtue?
I don't trouble myself too much with definitions. It's an attribute of people. Do we define it in the book?
Yeah, no. What he says
MacIntyre.
is the follow. Yeah, yes. I'm going. I need to read and translate. So
Yeah,
it's very. But the idea is that in Greek, Dane, that in Greek there is no difference between ought and must. I should do it and must do it. There is no clear difference. Again, in Iceland, the word skidler join the notion of I must and relative. If I'm a relative, I must do it since I'm a relative. And virtue, which was like the successor of arete, is being good at anything. If you run very well, you have a running virtue. Yeah. And in modern society, and this is the thesis of MacIntyre, in modern society, we encapsulated the word virtue to don't be sexually provocative. But if you want to go back to our Aristotle philosophy, you need to reconcile the concept of purpose. In Aristotle philosophy, there is a concept of purpose. There is a purpose to your existence. How can you reconcile the concept of purpose in a secular society?
So you're absolutely right. At least, look, I'm an amateur when it comes to reading philosophy, but I certainly take the same lesson that you do. I think purpose is at the heart of Aristotle. And I think his word for it is telos, the Greek word for the end. So, for example, are you a good interviewer? Well, what is the telos of interviewing? And so the question isn't how many views do you get. The question isn't how much money do you make. The question is isn't how many likes do you get. The question is how close do you come to achieving the telos of interview. And we can have a long discussion about what the telos of interviewing is.
And what is the telos of human being is?
Well, but at least if you're Aristotle, yes. You try to disaggregate and ask about the telos of particular activities. And that's progress, because you can make some progress, non-religious progress. You know, medicine has statements about the telos of medicine. Teaching has statements about the telos of teaching. Law has statements about the telos of legal practice. So the professions, at any rate, do make claims about what it means to be good at these things, and they aren't the same as being successful. So you can ask that question, understanding that the answers that people now provide are contested. The telos of teaching has changed over the years. The telos of medicine has changed over the years. These are organic concepts, and they develop as society's understanding of what it means to be good at these various things develop. And MacIntyre makes a big deal of this point and talks a word that we really rely on a lot. He talks about practices, using an ordinary word to capture a technical idea, which is the complex, organized social activities that are progressive. That is to say, they move, they change in time. And his view is that for the most part, it is practitioners who judge the telos of a practice. And so if I'm a doctor, I might well be interested in the patient's view of the telos of medicine, but I am much more interested in my colleague's view of the telos of medicine. And sometimes practices go off the rails, and unless people who are not in the practice start to intervene and pull it back on the rails, they can really misdirect themselves. But the key point is that there is a goal there is an endpoint, there is an appropriate purpose associated with the activity, and you are good at the activity to the extent that you are achieving that purpose. And societies judge, and I think MacIntyre here too thinks that secular societies have a much harder time making this judgment than religious ones do. Societies judge whether these various practices are in good repair or in bad repair, whether they need to be transformed or at least substantially modified, because there's no guarantee that they're going to, always be on the right path. So I think that's an effort to come up with a sort of secular morality where you invest a lot of your analytical and human effort into asking, what does it mean to be a good X, a good parent, a good friend, a good spouse, a good doctor, a good interviewer, a good teacher, and so on, and have that your view challenged by other people, so that the concept of the telos of the practice can evolve. That's the best I can do. That's what we rely on in the Practical Wisdom book.
The problem is
always going to leave you with a kind of uncertainty that a religious framework would resolve.
The problem is that the concept of good, the notion of good, is a very bad concept, because if you shoot your mother from 300 yards, one might say that this was a very good shot.
Yes.
So the concept of good is, but let's skip this. Let's skip this issue and go into.
So you may be a good shot, but that doesn't mean that shooting your mother was a good act.
Yes, but now you said, listen, rules. There is a proverb in Hebrew, and I'm sure in English, but I don't know how to say it. Rules were created that the stupid man will follow and the wise man will be guided by. I think that there is like an alternative quote in English. And my question is, when is it okay for us to break the rules?
Yeah.
Because you said that if you follow the rules, you gave in a recent interview a great example of, let's say that the map, you want to go to a certain place in Boston, but the maps only tells you how to get into Boston. Now, in order to go to this, like MIT, yes? I don't know. You said like a square or something like this. Do you remember the place?
Yeah, sure.
The idea is, yes.
You can't get to the right place unless you get to the right city, but getting to the right city doesn't get you to the right place. Yes.
And
that's what I said.
And the idea is that sometimes our governors think that they know better than us. And this is why the American Constitution is all about how things should be done and not what things should be done. And the whole idea of checks and balances and the whole respect to the American Constitution is exactly this point. Because when I want to break the law, I will have very good reasons why to do it. Let me quote Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy progressivism had its most dramatic effect in shaping a new view of the Constitution. He summed up his thoughts about the Constitution in one line: to hell with the Constitution when the people want coal. And this is a very bad quote. But Teddy Roosevelt thought he did the right thing. And my question is, what is your objective metric regarding, is it okay for me to break the Constitution, or I'm not smarter than my ancestor? I want I should obey the forefathers.
Right. So these are questions I can't answer. So if you decide, the way I expressed this in the TED Talk on wisdom was as follows. If you deviate from rules, there's no guarantee that your deviation will make things better. There's no guarantee that you will do the right thing. You could easily, with the best of intentions, deviate from rules and make things worse. So using your judgment does not guarantee success, even if you have good judgment. And there are people who have terrible judgment. So rules protect us from people who have bad judgment, and they protect us from people who have bad intentions. But the point we make in the book, and what I said in my TED Talk, was rules protect us from disaster, but they guarantee mediocrity.
This is great.
And that's because you can't write rules that will be the right course of conduct in every context with every person. You can't. So you have to be willing to let people, encourage people to use their judgment, and you have to make sure that in the course of their achieving a certain stature and responsibility in society, good judgment in them has been nurtured. You know, you don't turn crazy people loose and say, use your judgment. These need to be well-educated, wise people who will still make mistakes. There's a doctor we write about in the book named Jerome Groopman, who writes a lot of non-medical stuff for various highbrow magazines. And he talks about how he learned to give patients bad news and how bad he was at the beginning because he'd had no training in giving patients bad news. So he thought, be honest, be honest, be honest. And he wrecked one patient's life who lived with cancer for 5 or 8 years and was expecting every day would be his last. And so he backed away from that a little bit. And then there was another patient where he had exactly the opposite problem. He was so gentle and so delicate that this patient did no planning. And so his family was completely unprepared when he died. And slowly, over years and years of medical practice, he kind of got better and better at using his judgment. But, you know, it's, as I say when I talk about science to non-scientific...
Do you think, just a second, Barry, regarding the very last example, do you think that his skill that was gained over decades of hard, painful experience can be taught to a young medical doctor in the course of one semester? No.
No.
Definitely
no.
No way.
But I think here what you can do is make sure that part of your medical training includes having these conversations with a wise mentor watching and talking to you about what you could have done better, instead of the standard practice, which is when your supervisor has these conversations, it's in the study and the door is closed. So you get no exposure. Somehow you're supposed to know how you have difficult conversations with patients. And so the education begins when you've already got your license instead of when you're training to have your license.
Absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And you laid out the problems in a beautiful way. But again, my concern is that you present somewhat a naive perspective. A Silicon Valley professor at US university that say, listen, people have usually good intentions. I look around, I look right, I look left, and people have good intentions. You know, we all vote for the Democrat Party, etc. And I think one of the main problems with the Obama administration regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was his lack of knowledge in very different culture. Now, I had Richard Nisbet on the show, and he wrote a book called The Geography of Thought. It's a great book. And the idea is that what you, scholars from the US, Europe, think that every man, like when John Locke say, every man, blah, 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 blah. It's not every man, it's every Western man. And this
You're absolutely right. And that's why I have said now several times in our conversation that pluralism takes a hard problem and maybe makes it an impossible problem, because, you know, my view is that if you have a homogeneous society, the homogeneity of the citizens probably is enough so that even if the society becomes secular, everyone will have internalized a similar set of values and a similar understanding
definitely
about how to conduct yourself. So,
but if you worship diversity in a secular society, so you end up injecting hormones to a transgender child, and this is not from good intentions. I cannot believe that this is done from good intentions.
well, I think it's done with good intentions by some people and not by other people. But I used to have arguments all the time with my rabbi, the one who led this trip to Israel. As I told you before, it was a very progressive synagogue, but he was pretty committed to traditional practice himself when it came to religious things. And I would say to him all the time that progressive Judaism in the US is completely parasitic on Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Jews do things more or less the same way that they've been done for 5,700 years. And that's the anchor. And so if you form a progressive synagogue, you're always looking over your shoulder at what the frum people are doing. And that kind of keeps you from spinning into outer space. And that would drive him crazy, because he refused to accept that our progressive group actually depended on other groups that we were very critical of.
So just a second, progressive is not reform, because we know that there are conservative, reform, orthodox, but you say, listen, we have progressive. What is, just a second, for me, what is the difference between conservative and progressive?
Well, I don't know quite how to, I'm not sure I can answer that in a way that's satisfactory, but what I'm trying to, my take on the Orthodox conservative reform continuum is that mostly has to do with the description of modifications of religious practice and religious ceremony, and has left the sort of underlying ethical commitments untouched and to a large degree unexamined. It's really what happens when you go to shul, much more than what happens in your day-to-day life. When I use the word progressive, what I mean to capture is an orientation that penetrates everything, not simply how you worship, but also how you act in the world and what you value and why you value what you value. So, for example, my progressive synagogue, its religious practices were much more conservative than most Reformed synagogues, but our ethical commitments were way out there in comparison to the typical.
This is very interesting, because you will consider me as an Orthodox Jew. You will consider me as an Orthodox Jew. I live in the settlements, I live in the occupied territory, so I'm really Orthodox Jew. And I would consider some of my values, and I always look at, the internal values and try to adapt them or to reconcile them with my Western tradition, Western philosophy, Western thinking. So I always think in terms of, just a second, how does this internal truth, wisdom, can be applicable to now? And this is what I do as an Orthodox, because I think that my religion is not just a culture going to the shul and eating some chunt. Is need to guide me as an ethical compass. Therefore, I need to always, think, just a second, what do I think about, incorporating women in our society? This is very, I think that I do the exact same thing with you, but I call myself an Orthodox.
And the question, and this is really a question, I certainly don't have knowledge, is how often in Orthodox communities people have your attitude, where everything that you encounter every day creates a problem that you have to think through about what a commitment to good conduct requires, and how much of it is just sort of ritualized and knee-jerk and sort of designed to take those difficult life problems away by living in a highly restricted sort of environment where they don't come up. I don't know the answer to that. When I talk about Orthodox, conservative, and reform, it is, at least within the US context, and there's this category now, I guess it's true in Israel too, modern Orthodox, which seems to me capture much more what you just described.
I think that you will consider me as a modern Orthodox in the American way of thinking, but we don't have modern Orthodox here. But basically, yes, it's a modern Orthodox. It's
so
like
modern
I'm obliged.
Orthodox,
Yes.
what looks like to me from the outside is indeed what you just described. Somebody who is committed to deep theological principles and asks on a regular basis what these principles command and suggest when it comes to facing the day-to-day challenges that we all face living outside of the strictly
because
Orthodox.
We live in a Western secular society,
right.
And my question is,
well, how does that
what
teach
do
you?
how what can I put on the table of ideas? We have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have Nietzsche, we have Barry Schwartz, we have a lot of things. What can I put and say, this is part of my tradition? And my tradition is not just folklore, is a very deep wisdom, which leads me to the next question, because one thing that you, in order to make good choices or to be practical wisdom, you need to have the concept of delaying immediate gratification. And if you don't know to delay your immediate gratification, what will happen eventually is that you don't have the will or the willpower to do the right choice. So, and I didn't see that you talk in the book about delaying gratification, which I think is enormously important in the context of practical wisdom. You need to say, oh, I want to do it, but I won't. I won't because I want to. It's like a Zen thing.
Well, you're right. We don't talk about delaying gratification. I think that's a subset of a more general issue. I mean, it's not. This is about foregoing short-term gains or short-term pleasures in the service of longer-term gains.
Definitely.
But but why would anyone ever do that unless people had an understanding that there are some objectives that are more valuable, more important, and more fulfilling than others? You know, why would you not go to a bar the night before your final exam and instead study? You have to have some view, not simply that if you go to the bar, you'll do worse on the exam, but also that it is more important to do well on the exam than it is to hang out with friends. And that's often left undiscussed. Economists and psychologists spend a lot of time on delay of gratification and what's called
the marshmallow test.
What economists call temporal discounting. And what they never discuss is why some goals are more important than others. They simply assume that we all know that some goals are more important than others, and we lack enough control to always act in the service of those more important goals.
This is very interesting what you just said. Very, very interesting. So why, okay, so let me ask you this. Why all of us has like a ruler that we can balance and weight our goals and say, this goal is better, this goal is much more important, therefore, blah, 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 blah.
Well, I think we need it. I think most of us are not terribly reflective about it because these are hard questions to answer, and people like to avoid dealing with hard questions. You know, my rule of thumb, my personal rule of thumb is to ask, who will be affected by my behavior? You know, what kind of a shadow will my behavior cast? And when it's clear that what I do will have an impact on a lot of people, then that seems to me to make the decision more important than if it will only have an effect on me. But I don't take the next step and ask, why should it be that if it affects a lot of people, it's more important than if it only affects me? I don't take that step and ask that question because I don't know how to answer that question. But I at least feel comfortable with as a guide, when the span of influence of my actions is large, then I have to consider much more carefully and much more seriously the consequences of my actions. And that's why I always took teaching so seriously. You know, I had these 18-year-olds who knew nothing about anything and knew that a casual remark by me could set them off on a path that might turn out to be disastrous. So I was I tried to be very thoughtful and very careful in deciding what was worth talking about in the subject area and what wasn't, how it should be talked about, which ideas should be criticized, how they should be criticized, and why. Because I probably inflated my influence, because after all, I was just one teacher among many. But I saw that I could, with a casual remark, do real damage. And so that was always on my mind, and I tried to avoid it. So that's how I made that decision about what's more important than what. I think it has served me well, but I can't justify it.
This is very strange. This is very interesting. There is a rule of thumb that I occasionally use, and it was proposed by Gaon Mivilna. I don't know if you're familiar. He was a very famous rabbi in the 18th century. Hagaon, it was like the genius of Vilna. You will probably heard the name, but I misspelled it. Anyway, yeah. He said that if you have two routes to go, or two things that you don't know which one to choose the ones that you less want. Because more often than not, this will indicate the right thing to do. And the right things to do is not, what feels good. Go for the right thing to do.
I think that's not a bad rule of thumb.
Yes, for millennials, definitely.
It is not a bad rule of thumb, and it's certainly what we try to teach our kids when they're 6, 7 years old.
Yeah.
Now you have a choice, so choose what you don't want. Now try explaining that to a 6 or 7-year-old.
Now,
what you try to do as you're cultivating this kind of sensibility, I think, is organize the kids' lives so that the choices they face are highly structured and highly constrained, so that they are essentially nudged in the right direction. And it feels like they are the authors of their decisions, and they're in charge, and they're in control, and you respect them, but you essentially create environments where it's really hard for them to choose the wrong thing, because it's asking too much to ask a 7-year-old with really free choice to consistently choose the right thing. And my worry is that nowadays 20-year-olds are like 7-year-olds.
Yeah, definitely. I had a conversation with one of the leading of the gay community in Israel, and he's a religious gay, which is very funny because it's like an intrinsic oxymoron. Anyhow, I asked him how many gays there is in the population. What is the gay rate in the population according to your research? And he said 4%. So okay. And I showed him this Bill Maher research that Gen Z, approximately 20%, describes itself as part of the LGBTQ community. 20% in Gen Z. 20. We had 10% in millennial. We have 5% in Gen X, etc. For the gen of President Biden, it was 0.5%. So the gay. Anyhow, I said, listen, we have 16%. They were nudged into this direction because of media, because of you. You said 4, and they describe themselves as 20. We have 16%. They were nudged. They were steered toward this kind of activity or behavior or feeling, and you can manipulate kids in a very bad way like this. Now, this is just one way of manipulating kids. There are lots of ways one can manipulate kids.
Well,
And
but
yes,
just to offer an alternative account,
yes,
all of this is completely speculative. I have no idea whether what I'm about to say is true, but is at least possible. What is the true percentage of LGBTQ in the population? This is a very hard question to answer.
definitely.
Because there is no neutral environment in which to discover or create or choose your sexual identity.
And California is very different from Dallas, Texas.
No question about it. But is what we're getting now, what we're seeing now, an artificially inflated percentage, or is what we were seeing 50 years ago an artificially deflated percentage because there was such active discouragement? In other words,
my guess, and I think your guess, is also that both statements are correct.
Yeah. Just 1 second. Yeah, this is going to have to end soon. But yes, my guess is that this is a very complicated question. And you will, I hope, agree that we don't know what the baseline is, because it isn't as if people grow up in a state of nature and that gives you the pure incidence of homosexuality. Nobody grows up in a state of nature. They grow up in a state of culture. And so what's natural to people will depend on how the culture treats various kinds of practices, both trivial and not trivial. So
and you wrote a book about human nature, so you should know.
Well, I don't know that I should know, but a large point of my writing in that book is how much, the very distinguished anthropologist named Clifford Geertz wrote a book 50 years ago called The Interpretation of Cultures. And in that book, he describes human beings as, quote, unfinished animals, and perhaps unique in being unfinished animals. And what he meant by that is that you have this biological raw materials, but that doesn't make the person. Culture finishes people. And
like Lisa Barrett Feldman told me, we have the kind of nature that demands nurture.
Yes, that was Geertz's point. And it's not like you can avoid it. And so there's no neutral. You are going to be pushed and pulled in one direction or another, whether you want to or not. I can't just plunk you down and say, okay, you're on your own. You're never on your own. And the result is that questions like this about sexual identity, or about what people want out of work, or about what people think is a good life to live, all of these are completely infused with cultural presumptions. So, before The Paradox of Choice, I wrote a book called The Costs of Living, which nobody read. Then I wished I was famous. And the argument in that book was, to a large degree, how much the assumptions of neoclassical economics created social and cultural institutions.
The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than the commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite expert from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economists, which is attributed to John Maynard Keynes. And this is the opening quote in your last book, your most recent book, Why We Walk. This is what I wanted to be my last question, but you.
Yes, and I think that's right. And so there is what has replaced religious frameworks is not merely secular anything goes. It is secular maximize profit, maximize income, and that's the way to maximize welfare. So this is not a neutral culture in which people get to decide what they think is important in life. This is a culture that pushes people in one direction, in a particularly, in my view, particularly destructive direction when it comes to any aspiration to live a good life, because what it means to live a good life within this framework is to live a life that allows you to accumulate wealth.
This is great. This is great. Now we don't have many. We need to finish our conversation shortly. Therefore, I will ask you one question, and you are very productive. I looked at your Google Scholar page. I looked at all your papers and all your books. And this channel, YouTube channel, was originated in the concept of creativity. Could you and productivity? Could you please share with us one productivity tip that you utilize in your professional or personal life?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I learned this the hard way. When you're writing something, but it could apply to almost anything, it's very unintuitive. When you're writing something, it is a good idea to stop, not at a natural stopping point, but at an unnatural stopping point. Stop when you know what the next sentence or the next paragraph is going to be. And the reason
this is great. Yeah, I know. Wow, this is great.
This is that a lot of what really destroys people is that they're in this mode of working on whatever they're working on. They come to a natural stopping point, and then there's an enormous inertia about getting back to it because they don't know what they're going to do first.
Oh, this is great. This is great.
If you know exactly what you're going to do when you come back to your work, it's not as hard to come back to your work. And you write that next sentence or that next paragraph, and you're back in the flow. So as I say, it's a long time to learn this. I learned this the hard way. I was writing my very first book, and I would write, and I'd come to the end of a chapter, and then weeks would go by, and I couldn't bring myself to sit down and start writing the next chapter. And I learned by experience that if I stopped before I finished the chapter, I would have no problem coming back.
No,
so
this is a great tip. I wrote 4 books, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, but it's not the way most people operate.
No, definitely no.
You know, and in this age of divided attention, this is especially relevant because there's a lot of research done now by cognitive psychologists that most of the effort involved in doing hard things is in switching from one task to another. So the more distractions you have, the more time you spend switching, which is hard, effortful, exhausting.
Multitasking is a lie. It's just a lie. We don't multitask well as human beings.
We don't what?
We don't multitask well. And
no, we don't multitask at all.
Yes.
No, it is a huge
this is great.
lie. And you know, the problem was always there. You have responsibilities to your family, you have responsibilities to your friends. It's hard to keep your mind only on one thing. But now it's unbelievable. You know, you see your email messages accumulating on the bottom of your computer screen as you're working on whatever you're working on. Let me just see if any of those are important. And
this is great. This is great. This is a real,
that's a really tip.
Good tip. Yeah, definitely. Listen, next time you are in Israel, please stop by. You know, last Shabbat, you are familiar with Arthur Benjamin. He was like the mathematician at TED Talk. I hosted him last Shabbat. We went to the shul together and we had dinner. So next time you're in Israel, please stop by. I will treat you nice.
I will certainly let you know.
I will treat you
nice. This was really a pleasure. You were very challenging, which I'm happy about. And I hope that you at least found my answers responsive, if not convincing.
Definitely. And who should you think I contact after you? Who would you recommend me to contact? Like, you know, a very interesting man in the field of psychology.
Could it be an interesting woman?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, an interesting scholar. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, an interesting scholar. Yes. I had Lisa Barrett last week.
Hold on.
Definitely. Men, women, I don't care. Why? Because I only see for the top and the brightest.
In Israel.
Just a second.
Why is
because of you. Okay.
Michelle Gelfand is her name.
Michelle Gelfand. And what is the name of the book?
Rule Makers, Rule Breakers.
Okay. Michelle Gelfand. Are you familiar with her? Yeah, I know.
F-A-N-D. Yes,
yes.
she's a friend. And she's at Stanford University.
Yeah.
When you get in touch with her, you can tell her that you're doing it at my suggestion.
Yeah, she is Michelle Gelfand. And breaking rules in rule make, rule break. Oh, this is great.
She's only been at Stanford for a year, so a lot of the stuff you dredge up may attach her to the University of Maryland, which is where she used to be. But she's now at Stanford.
Wow, this was great. Barry, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your practical wisdom, and for everything. And thank you so much for what you, like, I gained so much from your knowledge throughout the years. And although I don't agree with you at all about luck and the lottery, I think that's what you...
That's a subject for another day.
Yes. But we both agree that keeping your marriage for 54 years has nothing to do with luck, as much more with hard, tedious, day-to-day work.
No question. Not so tedious. Not so tedious.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
Sure, take care.
Bye. On this channel, you will see the authors of these books and many more having great conversations with me. Please subscribe, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. See you in the next video.